Welcome to our Term 2 Quick Notes review, focusing on the cell membrane as well as surface area to volume ratio. So let's go ahead and write that in on the top. We're going to be talking about the cell membrane, and we're also going to be talking about surface area to volume ratio, but we're going to get to that in a second. Let's talk about the cell membrane first. The first thing that I want to do is talk about all of the names. Sometimes, unfortunately, in this class, and we've talked about this before, one thing can have many different names, and unfortunately, one of those instances happens to be with the cell membrane. So let's go ahead and talk about it. The cell membrane could be called, obviously, the cell membrane. That's its first name. But there are three other names that we could also use that also mean the same thing. We can also call the cell membrane the plasma membrane, still talking about the same structure, or we can call it the fluid mosaic model, which is a mouthful, which means the same thing as the cell membrane. And then finally, we could also call it the phospholipid bilayer. And again, all four names mean the same thing. Now, regardless of what name we call it, the cell membrane or the plasma membrane or the fluid mosaic or the phospholipid bilayer only has one job. And we've talked about the job before when we talked about cellular organelles. The only job of the cell membrane is to maintain homeostasis. And it maintains homeostasis by controlling what can enter and leave the cell. So you need to make sure that you know what its job is, regardless of what it's actually named, what it's actually called. Now, because it's able to maintain or control what can enter and leave the cell, or its ability to do that is dependent on its actual structure. So this is my definition of the cell membrane. So we have the definition here. We have the name here. The next thing that I want to talk about is the actual structure. So we're going to talk about the structure next. Now, before we talk about the whole structure, I want to start out by saying that the cell membrane is essentially made up of one particular structure that you need to know about. And that one particular structure is something called the phospholipid. And a phospholipid is made up of a head that has two tails. So this whole structure is referred to as a phospholipid, and that name should look familiar to you because here it is. It's also, the cell membrane is also called the phospholipid bilayer because we have two layers of these things. Now, my phospholipid bilayer is named such because of the actual components of this phospholipid. So the first component is this guy right here, which is the head, and the head is made up of a phosphate, and my phosphate happens to be polar. And because it's polar, it has a very similar characteristic to water. So it actually loves water. So we're going to call this part something referred to as hydrophilic, meaning water loving. It loves to be around water. On the flip side, when we look at the bottom, we're going to be talking about the tails. Now, the tails are fatty acids. And if you remember our lipid conversation during term 1, you'll remember that fatty acids are nonpolar. They are the opposite of water because they don't have a charge. And because they're the opposite of water, we can say that they don't like water. They shun water. So instead of being hydrophilic, which means water loving, we're going to say that they're hydrophobic, which means water fearing. Now we're going to take this one structure, this one phospholipid, and we're going to show you how it makes up the entire structure of a cell membrane. So in order to do that, I'm going to go ahead and draw a circle. So I'm going to draw a circle over here. And when I draw that circle, this circle represents my cell membrane. So this is my cell membrane, and obviously it surrounds the entire cell. Well, if I go ahead and I were to zoom in on just a cross section, so if we were to zoom into this part specifically right here, what we'll notice is that it's not actually one line. Instead, we're going to see something that looks like this. We're going to see heads on both sides because we have two layers. And we're going to see tails coming off that are going to be facing each other. All right, so we actually have this surrounding the entire cell. Now this has a unique chemical structure because these heads like water. This is going to be our hydrophilic zone. And we also have a hydrophilic zone down here. It's the same as what we saw up top. Now on the inside where we have our tails, this is going to be the part that hates water. This is going to be our hydrophobic zone. And that basically makes up the structure of the cell membrane. There are some other things that are going to be embedded in. Sometimes we'll see things like protein. So there might be a protein embedded on the inside that can help with transport or identification or communication. So we could also have a cell membrane protein. And then the last thing that you might see embedded inside of this structure is something called cholesterol. And cholesterol tends to look like a honeycomb like this. And our cholesterol is important because the cholesterol helps to maintain the fluidity of the membrane. So without the cholesterol, the cell membrane would actually crack in half. It wouldn't be able to bend or change shape depending on the need of the cell. So that's the basic makeup of the cell membrane that you need to know because you're going to see it on your assessment. Now that we've talked about that, let's quickly talk about the next thing that you're going to see on your assessment that applies to this same notion of the cell membrane or the surrounding or the outer portion of the cell membrane, and that is surface area to volume ratio. So I'm going to go ahead and separate these two parts right now so that we see that they are two separate parts of our notes, because you're going to need them for two separate sections of questions that you'll see after the notes on your day sheet. And I'm going to go ahead and label this surface area to volume. And we're going to talk about why this is important. The first thing that I want to tell you that you need to write down is that when we're talking about cells, size matters. And there's a reason why size matters. Because when we are looking at cells, surface area increases at a slower rate than volume. Now that's sometimes hard to think about. What does that really mean? Well, here's what it means. If I have a cell, so here's one cell. So this is cell A, and I have another cell, cell B. When I'm comparing these two cells, the inside of the cell increases faster than the outside. And it's the outside which is the surface area, and it's the inside which is the volume. Now, we never want the inside to increase super fast and the outside to increase slowly, because as that cell gets bigger, things on the inside get further away from the cell membrane. And that's a problem because we need to be able to move things into and out of the cell. So we need to be able to bring in nutrients and gases, and we need to be able to eliminate things like waste product. And if we can't do that quickly, the cell actually dies. So we need to pay attention to surface area to volume ratio to ensure the cell's efficiency. So on your test, if you're given the option, if you're asked which one of these cells do you think is more efficient, you always want to pick the smaller cell. So the smaller cell is always going to be the most efficient. So I'm going to write smaller cell equals most efficient. It's the reason why you guys are made up of 75 trillion small cells instead of just one or two really large blobby cells. If you're made up of just one or two really large blobby cells, it would take too long for things to get into and out of the cells, and they would die. If you think back to what we talked about in class, we used our Super Walmart versus our Reed's grocery store analogy. Remember, it's a lot easier to find things and to go shopping in Reed's grocery store than it is in Super Walmart, because Super Walmart, its volume is so large, everything is really far away from the exit and the entry to the store. Unlike Reed's, you can just pop into Reed's really quickly because the inside of the store or the volume is not very big, so it's easy to pop in, find what you need, and get out quickly. So we want ourselves to be like Reed's grocery stores. So I'm going to go ahead and label that. We want this to be like Reed's, and we don't want a Walmart cell in any sort of living things. Now, the language that we're going to use to help us remember that, which is sometimes difficult to think about, because when we talk about surface area, we always want to think about small cells equals the most efficient. But the way that the language that we're going to use when we're talking about surface area to volume, we always want to say that we want a large surface area to volume ratio. All that means is we want this number to be really big and we want this number to stay as small as possible. All right, you have all the important information you need to help you review the cell membrane as well as surface area to volume ratio. Go ahead and use these notes to help you answer the challenge questions that are on your day sheet. If you have any questions, feel free to stop me so that we can go over it together. Good luck, guys. Thanks.